I knew my wife was trying to take everything from me when my phone showed the words, "Transfer blocked." At 2:13 in the morning, I sat alone in the dark glow of my home office, staring at a notification that should have destroyed me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Certainty. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 45 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed that if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and built something with someone you loved, that foundation would always protect you. I was wrong about one thing. A foundation is only as strong as the people standing on it. The screen in front of me showed 3 attempted transfers from our joint account. The amounts were not small. $25,000, $50,000, $75,000. 3 separate attempts in less than 10 minutes. Each one stopped before the money could leave. I didn't panic. I didn't call Rachel. I didn't walk upstairs and demand answers. I just leaned back in my chair and looked at the quiet room around me. The framed photos on my desk. The coffee mug she bought me years ago. The picture of us standing outside our first house, smiling like 2 people who believed we had already won. Funny how a single moment can change the way you see everything that came before it. 2 years earlier, I would have been heartbroken by that notification. That night, I was simply disappointed. Because this wasn't the first sign. It was just the first one I could no longer ignore. Rachel and I had been married for 17 years. We weren't one of those couples who fell in love during some dramatic movie moment. It was simpler than that. We met at a small coffee shop in downtown Chicago. She was sitting by the window with a stack of real estate brochures, and I was trying to finish a report before work. She smiled at me because I accidentally took the chair she was saving. I apologized. She laughed. That was it. A small moment. But small moments are where most lives begin. Over the years, we built a life together. We bought a modest home in the suburbs. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet weekends where doing nothing felt like everything. I worked long hours as a financial analyst, and Rachel built a successful career in real estate consulting. I was proud of her. I told people that all the time. I never saw her success as a threat. I saw it as something we created together. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Rachel stopped talking about our future and started talking about what she deserved. Conversations that used to be about dreams became conversations about numbers. How much was the house worth? How much was in retirement accounts? How quickly could certain assets be moved? At first, I thought she was just becoming more financially responsible. I told myself that was a good thing. A marriage needs planning. A family needs security. But then the questions became different. They were no longer about building something together. They were about protecting herself from me. The strange part was that I didn't discover this because I was searching for problems. I discovered it because problems started leaving fingerprints. A missing bank statement. A password changed without explanation. A meeting with a financial advisor that she never mentioned. Little things. Small cracks. The kind most people ignore because admitting what they mean is painful. I wanted to believe Rachel was still the person I married. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. But then I found the email. A message between Rachel and someone from a financial office. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was organized. It contained questions about separating accounts, moving funds, and protecting personal assets before a conversation I was never invited to have. That was the moment I understood. Rachel wasn't preparing for a difficult conversation. She was preparing for a different life. And she thought I would be standing still when it happened. She thought I was the same man who would react emotionally, argue, and make mistakes. She didn't know that for weeks, I had quietly started documenting everything. She didn't know that I had already spoken with professionals. She didn't know that every major transfer from our account had been secured. She thought she was making her move. What she didn't realize was that I had already made mine. After that night, I stopped looking at Rachel the way I used to. Not because I suddenly hated her, but because I finally understood that I had been holding on to a version of my marriage that no longer existed. The hardest part about betrayal is not the moment you discover it. It is the moment afterward, when ordinary things continue happening even though your entire understanding of your life has changed. The next morning, sunlight came through the kitchen windows exactly the same way it always did. The coffee machine made the same sound. The neighborhood outside looked peaceful. A delivery truck stopped at the house across the street. Everything looked normal. Except nothing felt normal anymore. Rachel walked into the kitchen wearing her usual business clothes, carrying her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She looked calm. Almost too calm. That was when I realized something important. She had already convinced herself that her plan was reasonable. In her mind, she was not doing something wrong. She was protecting herself. People can justify almost anything when they tell themselves the right story. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Years ago, I would have searched her face for a sign, a hint of guilt, a reason to believe I was misunderstanding everything. But after seeing those emails and those transfer attempts, I knew the truth was not hiding anymore. "Not really," I said. She nodded and continued making breakfast like it was any other morning. That was the strange part. The person who was preparing to separate our finances was still the same person who reminded me to take my vitamins and asked about my meetings. It felt like watching someone perform a role they had memorized. For the next few days, I did something that felt unnatural. I stayed quiet. I went to work. I answered emails. I came home. I asked about her day. I listened. Not because I was pretending everything was fine. I was learning. I needed to understand how far this had gone. I started noticing details I had ignored before. Rachel spent more time away from home. She had more private conversations. She became protective of her phone. If I walked into the room while she was reading something, she would quickly change screens. Small actions, small moments. But small moments tell the truth when people think nobody is paying attention. I remembered when we first bought our house. It was not the biggest house on the street. It did not have a huge backyard or expensive upgrades. But we loved it because it represented everything we had built together. We painted the walls ourselves. We carried furniture up the stairs ourselves. We celebrated the first night there with takeout sitting on the floor because we had not bought a dining table yet. Rachel looked around that empty room and said, "One day, we are going to look back and be proud of this." I believed her. I believed that sentence for 17 years. That was what made the situation difficult. I was not just protecting money. I was protecting the life we created. But protecting something does not mean refusing to accept when it is changed. A week after the transfer attempts, I received another message from the financial institution confirming that my restrictions were still active. I stared at the notification for several seconds. There was no satisfaction, no feeling of victory, only a quiet reminder that I had reached a point where protecting myself had become necessary. That evening, Rachel sat across from me at dinner and started talking about future plans. She mentioned renovations. She mentioned vacations. She mentioned ideas for the next few years. I listened carefully, because there was something almost painful about hearing someone talk about a future they were quietly planning without you. After dinner, I went back to my office and opened the folder where I had saved everything. The emails, the dates, the account records, the notes from conversations. Every piece told the same story. I closed the folder and sat there in silence. I knew the next step would be difficult, but I also knew something I had not known before. I was no longer reacting to what Rachel was doing. I was prepared for what came next. The first thing I learned after discovering Rachel's plan was that betrayal rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. It usually arrives quietly. It hides inside normal conversations, ordinary routines, and moments that seem too small to matter. That was how it happened in my marriage. There was no single argument that destroyed everything. There was no one moment where the world suddenly changed. Instead, there were dozens of small moments that I ignored because I wanted to believe the best about the person beside me. Looking back, I could see the pattern clearly. At the time, I only saw pieces. A strange question here. A hidden conversation there. A sudden interest in details she had never cared about before. Rachel had always been ambitious. That was one of the things I loved about her. When we met, she had a confidence that filled every room she entered. She believed she could build something from nothing. I admired that because I was the same way. I was never the type of person who expected success to arrive overnight. I believed in patience. I believed in showing up every day and doing the work. That was how I built my career. That was how we built our home. But over the years, Rachel's idea of success started changing. It was no longer about creating a life together. It became more about comparing what we had to what other people had. I noticed it during dinners with friends. She would look around at bigger houses, newer cars, and expensive vacations, then become quiet on the drive home. At first, I thought she was just dreaming about improving our life. I understood that. Everyone wants more. Everyone wants to grow. But slowly, those dreams started creating distance between us. She stopped asking about my day and started asking about account balances. She stopped talking about memories and started talking about numbers. I tried to have conversations with her. I asked if something was bothering her. I asked if she felt unhappy. Every time, she gave the same answer. I am fine. But I learned something after 17 years of marriage. Sometimes the words people say are not as important as the way they say them. Rachel was not fine. She was somewhere else emotionally, even when she was sitting across from me. The turning point came when I found out she had been meeting with a financial advisor without telling me. It was not the meeting itself that bothered me. Couples should understand their finances. Couples should plan for the future. What bothered me was the secrecy. When I asked her about it, she looked surprised that I knew. Only for a second, but that second told me everything. It was just a consultation, she said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. I wanted to understand my options. Options. That word stayed in my mind long after the conversation ended. I remember standing in the kitchen after she walked away, looking at the refrigerator covered with old photos and family memories. There were pictures from vacations, birthdays, and holidays. 17 years of moments captured on paper. But suddenly, I wondered if we had been looking at those memories differently. Maybe I saw a life we built together. Maybe she saw something she could divide. I did not confront her further because I knew emotions would not help me. Anger creates noise. Preparation creates clarity. So I continued collecting information. I reviewed the records carefully. I looked at the timeline. I noticed when things changed and when certain decisions started happening. The more I learned, the more one thing became clear. Rachel had been planning this for longer than I realized. But there was something she did not understand about me. I was quiet, but I was not unaware. I was patient, but I was not powerless. For most of my life, people had mistaken my calm nature for weakness. They saw someone who avoided conflict and assumed he would simply accept whatever happened. Rachel made that mistake too. She forgot that the same person who spent years building a career, managing responsibilities, and protecting a family was capable of protecting himself when necessary. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in my office again. The room was silent except for the sound of the clock on the wall. I looked through the documents one more time. I did not feel angry. I did not feel victorious. I felt something different. I felt ready. Because I finally understood the truth. The biggest mistake Rachel made was not trying to change our financial situation. It was believing that I would not notice the change happening right in front of me. The hardest part about keeping a secret is not hiding information from someone else. It is carrying the weight of knowing something that could change everything. For the next several days, I lived with that weight. I woke up beside the same person, drove the same roads, and walked through the same front door, but my perspective had completely changed. I was no longer looking at my marriage through memories. I was looking at it through evidence. And evidence has a way of removing the excuses we create for the people we love. I started paying closer attention to the details I had ignored before. Not because I wanted to find reasons to blame Rachel, but because I needed to understand what was actually happening. There is a difference between suspicion and awareness. Suspicion makes you imagine things. Awareness makes you observe what is already there. I noticed that Rachel had started organizing her life around a future that did not include me. She had separate appointments, separate conversations, separate plans. The little things were everywhere if I was willing to see them. One evening, I came home earlier than expected. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. The moment she noticed me, she closed the screen. It was a simple movement, something most people would forget 5 minutes later. But after everything I knew, that small action felt different. Working late? I asked. Just catching up on some things, she replied. Her answer was casual, but her eyes moved away from mine. I did not push. I had learned that forcing someone to reveal the truth rarely works. People reveal themselves when they believe they are in control. That night, after dinner, I went back to my office and reviewed everything I had collected. I created a timeline, not an emotional one, a factual one. Dates, conversations, financial activity, changes in behavior. I wrote everything down because memories can become complicated when emotions are involved. Facts are different. Facts stay where you put them. The timeline showed something I did not want to admit. Rachel had not suddenly changed. She had been slowly preparing for a different outcome. I thought about all the years we spent together, all the decisions we made as a team. When we bought our first home, we sat at the dining room table with a calculator, coffee, and a stack of papers. We were nervous because it was the biggest financial decision of our lives. Rachel held my hand and said, "We are building this together." Those words stayed with me, because now I wondered when together stopped meaning the same thing to her. A few days later, I scheduled a meeting with someone who could help me understand my options. I did not go there looking for revenge. I did not want to punish Rachel. I wanted clarity. I wanted to make sure that the years I spent building our life were protected. The office was quiet, the kind of place where people speak carefully because every word matters. I explained everything from the beginning. I showed the records I had saved. I explained the attempted transfers. I explained the conversations I had overheard and the changes I had noticed. The advice I received was simple. Stay calm. Document everything. Do not make decisions based on emotion. That advice matched who I was. I had spent my entire life solving problems by thinking clearly. This situation was no different. When I returned home that evening, Rachel was watching television in the living room. She looked comfortable, peaceful, almost like she had no idea that the ground beneath her plans had changed. I sat beside her and watched the screen without really seeing it. Part of me wanted to ask why. Why would someone I trusted for 17 years secretly prepare to separate what we built? Why did she believe the answer was to move pieces around instead of having an honest conversation? But I already knew that those questions would not give me peace. Some answers only create more pain. The truth was already there. Rachel had made her choice. Now I had to make mine. I was no longer waiting for her to decide what happened next. I was preparing to protect myself, my future, and everything I had worked for. The strange thing was, the more prepared I became, the calmer I felt. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to save something that only one person was fighting for. There is a strange feeling that comes when you stop trying to understand why someone changed and start accepting that they did. For years, I had searched for explanations. I blamed stress. I blamed busy schedules. I blamed the natural distance that sometimes happens in long marriages. I told myself every relationship goes through difficult seasons. But eventually, you have to ask yourself a harder question. Are you going through a difficult season, or are you standing in a completely different life than the one you thought you were building? By that point, I knew Rachel and I were no longer standing on the same side. The only difference was that she did not know I had realized it yet. I continued my normal routine. I went to work every morning, answered calls, attended meetings, and came home every evening. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was intentional. I did not want a confrontation based on emotions. I wanted to make sure every decision I made was thoughtful and careful. I had spent 17 years building stability. I was not going to let one painful discovery make me act without thinking. During that time, I started organizing everything I knew. I reviewed our financial records, not because I wanted to control Rachel, but because I needed to understand the full picture. I looked at our accounts, our shared expenses, and the history of major transactions. I wanted to know if this was a sudden decision or something she had been planning for a long time. The answer became clearer with every document I reviewed. There were patterns, small movements that seemed meaningless individually, but together they told a story. Rachel had been preparing. She had researched things I never knew she was interested in. She had asked questions about separating finances. She had explored options without ever sitting down with me for an honest conversation. That part hurt more than the money. Money can be replaced. Trust is harder to rebuild. I remembered a conversation we had years earlier when we were still young in our marriage. We were sitting on the back porch of our first home, watching the sunset over the neighborhood. We were talking about the future, retirement, travel, the possibility of helping our family someday. Rachel looked at me and said, "As long as we are together, we can handle anything." At the time, I believed those words completely. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I trusted the promise more than the person who made it. A few days after my meeting with the financial advisor, I received a call from the bank. They wanted to confirm the restrictions that had been placed on certain transactions. Everything was still in place. The accounts were secure. The safeguards were working exactly as planned. The person on the phone spoke professionally, but I barely heard the details. My mind was somewhere else. I was thinking about how strange it was that I had reached a point where protecting myself from my own spouse felt necessary. That evening, Rachel came home later than usual. She placed her bag on the counter and asked about my day. I answered normally. She smiled and started talking about a project she was working on. I listened. I always listened. That had always been one of my strengths. But now I was hearing her differently. I noticed what she said and what she avoided saying. I noticed how easily she moved through the evening, unaware that the situation she had been creating was no longer going according to plan. After dinner, she mentioned that she might need to make some changes with our accounts soon. She said it casually, like she was discussing a home repair or a routine appointment. I looked at her and asked, "What kind of changes?" She paused for just a moment. "Nothing serious. Just making things easier." That answer stayed with me. Making things easier. Easier for who? I wanted to ask, but I already knew. I simply nodded and changed the subject. That night, I sat in my office and looked at the documents in front of me. The room was quiet. The same room where I had spent years working late, planning our future, and believing I was building something permanent. Now it had become the place where I prepared for a reality I never expected. I did not feel like I had won anything. There was no satisfaction in being prepared for the person you loved to disappoint you. But there was peace in knowing I was no longer walking into the unknown. Rachel believed she was several steps ahead. She believed she understood the situation better than I did. What she did not realize was that while she was planning her next move, I was already preparing for the moment when the truth could no longer stay hidden. The day I realized Rachel was about to make her move, everything looked completely ordinary. That was the strange part. The world does not stop when your life changes. The clock keeps moving. Cars still drive down the street. People still go to work. The same coffee shop still opens every morning. But inside your own mind, everything feels different. I remember waking up that morning and hearing Rachel moving around downstairs. The sound was familiar. After 17 years, you learn the small sounds of another person's routine. The cabinet opening. The coffee machine starting. The footsteps across the floor. For years, those sounds meant home. That morning, they felt like reminders of something I could not ignore anymore. I walked into the kitchen and saw Rachel standing by the counter, checking her phone. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning," she said. I smiled back. "Morning." It was a simple exchange, but there was something unusual about it. We were both acting normal, but for completely different reasons. I was staying calm because I wanted clarity. Rachel was staying calm because she believed she was in control. She had no idea how much I already knew. Over the next few days, I watched carefully, not in a suspicious way. Not because I wanted to find reasons to be angry. I was simply paying attention to things I had stopped noticing. Sometimes, when you love someone for a long time, you stop observing them. You assume you already know everything about them. You know their habits. You know their thoughts. You know how they will react. But people can change quietly. They can create new priorities without telling you. They can build plans while still sitting across the dinner table from you. One afternoon, I received a notification about a financial document that had been accessed. It was not unusual for someone to review records, but the timing caught my attention. I checked the information and saw activity connected to questions about transferring certain funds. It was another piece of the puzzle, another small confirmation that what I had suspected was real. I sat at my desk for several minutes without moving. I looked around the room. This was where I had spent countless evenings working after long days. This was where I paid bills, planned budgets, and organized our future. I never imagined this room would become the place where I protected myself from the person I trusted most. But I also knew something important. I could not let disappointment make my decisions for me. I needed to stay focused. That evening, Rachel came home and seemed unusually relaxed. She talked about a new opportunity at work. She talked about people she had met. She talked about future plans. I listened quietly. Then she said something that caught my attention. "I think it is time we start thinking more independently." She said it like it was a simple life adjustment. Like she was suggesting a new routine or a different way to organize our schedule. But I understood what she meant. She was creating distance. "Independent?" I asked. Rachel nodded. "Yes. We both need to make sure we are protected." Protected. Another word that sounded harmless but carried a different meaning. I looked at her and wondered when we stopped being partners. When did protecting ourselves start meaning protecting ourselves from each other? I did not argue. I did not accuse her. I simply nodded and continued eating dinner. I knew an emotional conversation would only give her a chance to deny everything before I was ready. The truth was already enough. I did not need a confession. I needed to be prepared. Later that night, I reviewed the final steps I had taken. Everything was organized. Every important document was saved. Every necessary protection was in place. I had not done it because I wanted to win against Rachel. I had done it because I needed to make sure that my future was not decided without my voice being heard. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The same street where Rachel and I had walked together years earlier. The same place where we thought we were building a forever life. I realized something in that moment. Sometimes the person you need to protect yourself from is not a stranger. Sometimes it is the person who knows exactly where you keep everything valuable. Rachel thought she was preparing for a new chapter. She did not know that the chapter she was writing was about to reveal the truth about everything we had built. The moment I had been preparing for did not arrive with an argument. It arrived with a simple message on my phone. That was the strange thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. They appear quietly, almost casually, and then suddenly you realize everything has shifted. I was sitting at my desk early in the morning when the notification appeared. It was from the bank. There had been another attempt to move funds. Another step in a plan I now understood completely. I looked at the screen for a few seconds and then placed my phone on the desk. I did not feel surprised. I did not feel angry. I felt calm. Months earlier, that same message would have sent me into panic. I would have walked into the kitchen, demanded answers, and asked Rachel how she could do something like that. But now I understood something important. The person who reacts first often loses control of the situation. I had spent enough time watching Rachel prepare her next move. Now it was time for me to stop waiting. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. Rachel was in the living room reviewing something on her laptop. When she saw me, she quickly closed it. The old version of me would have noticed and asked questions immediately. The person I had become simply walked over and placed my keys on the counter. "Long day?" she asked. "A little," I answered. We talked about normal things. Work, the weather, plans for the weekend. It felt almost strange how easy it was to continue a conversation when both people knew something important was being hidden. But I had learned that patience reveals more than confrontation. After dinner, Rachel brought up our finances again. This time, she was more direct. She said she thought it was time we reviewed everything separately. She talked about independence. She talked about making sure both of us had control over our own futures. Her words sounded reasonable. If someone heard only that conversation, they might have thought she was simply being responsible. But context matters. Words do not exist alone. They are connected to actions. And Rachel's actions had already told me what her words were trying to hide. I looked at her and asked a simple question. "Why now?" She paused. Only briefly. But that pause answered more than her words could. "I just think it is important," she said. I nodded. "I understand." That was all I said. I could see the surprise on her face. She expected resistance. She expected an emotional reaction. She expected me to make the mistake she had planned for. But I did not give her that opportunity. The next day, I finalized the last steps of my preparation. I reviewed every document one more time. I confirmed every account detail. I made sure everything was organized and clear. The goal was never to embarrass Rachel or create a dramatic confrontation. My goal was simple: protect what I had worked for and make sure decisions were made fairly. There is a difference between revenge and responsibility. Revenge is about hurting someone because they hurt you. Responsibility is about making sure you are not harmed because you refuse to pay attention. That difference mattered to me. Because despite everything that happened, Rachel was still someone I had loved for 17 years. I did not want to become a person I did not recognize just because someone else changed. A few days later, Rachel made the move she had been preparing for. She believed she had found the perfect moment. She believed she had everything arranged. But when she tried to complete the financial changes she had planned, she discovered something she never expected. The process did not move forward. The accounts were protected. The transfers were restricted. The system stopped exactly where I had prepared for it to stop. I was not there when she saw the notification. I did not need to be. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen without an audience. I imagined her sitting there, realizing that the person she thought was unaware had actually been paying attention the entire time. That was the moment the balance changed. Not because I had taken control away from her, but because I had finally taken responsibility for my own future. For weeks, Rachel believed she was the only person making plans. She believed she was several steps ahead. What she never considered was that silence does not always mean ignorance. Sometimes silence means someone is carefully deciding what to do next. The first time I saw Rachel realize something had changed, it was not through an argument or an angry conversation. It was through silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone expects a certain reaction and does not receive it. For weeks, Rachel had been moving carefully, making plans, organizing information, and assuming I was unaware. She had built her entire strategy around one belief. She believed I was still the same person who would react emotionally when things became difficult. She believed I would ask questions before I had answers. She believed I would give away my position before I understood hers. But she had misunderstood me. I was not ignoring what was happening. I was watching. The morning after the failed transfer attempt, the atmosphere in our house felt different. Rachel moved through the kitchen quietly. She made coffee, checked her phone, and avoided making eye contact for longer than a few seconds. It was a small change, but after everything I had noticed, small changes meant something. Did something happen? I asked. She looked up quickly. What do you mean? You seem distracted. She smiled slightly. Just a busy morning. I nodded. I did not push. I had learned that people often reveal more when they are not being pressured. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the financial office. They confirmed that the restrictions were active and that everything was handled according to the instructions I had provided. The conversation was professional and brief, but when I ended the call, I sat there for a moment thinking about how much my life had changed. A few months earlier, I was planning a vacation with my wife. I was thinking about home improvements. I was thinking about the next chapter of our lives together. Now I was making plans to protect myself from someone who used to be my closest partner. That realization was difficult. Not because I regretted protecting myself, but because I wished I had never needed to. That evening, Rachel finally brought up the subject directly. We were sitting at the dining table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays, shared holiday meals, and made some of the biggest decisions of our lives. She placed her hands together and looked serious. Michael, I think we need to talk about the future. I knew that moment would come. I had prepared for it. But preparation does not make a conversation easier. It only helps you stay calm. Okay, I said. Rachel explained that she wanted more control over her finances. She said she felt like things needed to be separated. She used careful words. Words designed to sound reasonable, but I was listening to the meaning behind them. She was not asking how we could solve a problem together. She was explaining a decision she had already made. Have you been planning this for a while? I asked. For the first time, her confidence changed. Her expression shifted slightly. What makes you say that? She asked. I looked at her calmly. Because people do not wake up one day and start researching financial separation without a reason. The room became quiet. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Just quiet. Rachel looked away. That moment told me more than any confession could have. She knew I understood. I was trying to make sure I had options, she said. I took a breath before answering. Options are not the problem, Rachel. The problem is making decisions about our life without including me. She did not respond immediately. And honestly, I did not expect her to. Sometimes people do not have an answer because the truth is harder to explain than the story they created. I spent 17 years believing we were a team. I believed problems were something we faced together. But at some point, Rachel had started preparing for a future where I was no longer her partner. The difference was that I had finally accepted it. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of being a bad person. I simply explained that I had also taken steps to protect myself. That was when I saw the first real sign of uncertainty. She realized I was not confused. She realized I was not behind. She realized I had been paying attention. The conversation did not end with a dramatic conclusion. There were no perfect words that could repair 17 years of broken trust in one evening. But something important happened. For the first time in a long time, we were no longer pretending. The truth was finally sitting between us. And once the truth appears, everything built on pretending starts to fall apart. After that conversation, something changed inside the house. Not because everything suddenly became easier, but because the pretending stopped. For weeks, Rachel and I had been living in the same rooms while carrying completely different realities. She was preparing for a future where she stood alone. I was preparing for the moment when I would have to accept that the partnership I believed in was no longer the same. The strange thing was, once everything was finally spoken out loud, I felt calmer. There was no more guessing. No more searching for answers hidden between conversations. The uncertainty was gone. And sometimes the truth, even when painful, is easier to carry than confusion. The days that followed were quiet. Rachel and I still shared the same home, but there was a distance between us that had not been there before. We handled practical things. Bills, schedules, household responsibilities. But the conversations that once filled our evenings were gone. I think both of us understood that something had reached a point where it could not simply return to the way it was. I spent more time thinking about the past, not because I wanted to live there, but because I needed to understand how we arrived at this place. I remembered the early years when we had almost nothing. We were not wealthy. We did not have expensive vacations or a perfect home, but we had something I thought was more valuable: trust. We built our life one decision at a time. We saved money. We supported each other. We made sacrifices because we believed those sacrifices were creating something meaningful. That was the part one struggled with most. It was not the financial situation. It was the feeling that the person who once stood beside me had started looking at me like an obstacle. A few weeks later, we met with professionals to discuss the next steps. Everything was handled carefully and respectfully. There were no dramatic scenes, no attempts to embarrass each other. I had already decided that I did not want this process to become a battle. I wanted fairness. I wanted honesty. I wanted to walk away knowing I had acted with integrity. During those meetings, Rachel seemed different. The confidence she had carried before was not as strong. I think she finally understood that the situation was not as simple as she had imagined. She had expected me to be surprised. She had expected me to be unprepared. She had expected emotions to control the outcome. Instead, she found someone who had taken time to think. One afternoon, after we finished discussing the practical details, Rachel asked me a question I did not expect. "When did you know?" I looked at her for a moment. "Know what?" She looked down. "That I was making plans." I could have answered with anger. I could have reminded her of every detail I discovered, but I did not. "I knew when I realized you were making decisions about our future without wanting to talk about them with me." She was quiet. I continued. "The money was never the biggest issue. The trust was. That was the truth. The financial situation was only the visible part of something deeper. A relationship does not fall apart because of one account or one decision. It falls apart when two people stop believing they are on the same side." Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my own life. Not by trying to prove anything to Rachel. Not by trying to make her regret her choices. I simply started putting my energy into things I had neglected. I spent more time with friends. I returned to hobbies I had forgotten. I focused on my health, my career, and my own peace of mind. For the first time in years, I started asking myself what I wanted instead of only thinking about what we needed. There was a lesson I learned from everything that happened. Being loyal does not mean ignoring reality. Being patient does not mean accepting everything. And loving someone does not mean abandoning yourself. I spent 17 years believing that protecting a marriage meant holding on no matter what. But I learned that sometimes protecting your future means accepting when something has already changed. Rachel and I eventually moved forward separately. It was not easy. Ending a chapter that lasted 17 years never is. But I walked away knowing something important. I had not lost because someone tried to take control of the situation. I had already found something more valuable. I had found clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the first step toward a better life.